and then jumping into your presentation. Thomas, take it over. Thank you. I think we've got you muted right now, Thomas, so you can come off mute. Thomas, can you hear me? You're muted.
Yes. So
there we go.
Welcome. I'd like to share with you a few minutes of some of my viewpoints about startup issues. Okay. So please notice that my email is on this slide. So feel free to send me an email and we can chat, exchange some email, and I would love to help startups with some of my experience and viewpoints and hopefully be a benefit to your startup project. Okay. Next. Okay. So recently I saw this talk on YouTube by a fellow named Bill Gross, the founder of Idea Labs. And it was what they call a TED Talk on 5 factors for startup success based on 200 startups. 100 of these startups are Idea Lab startups and 100 are non-Idea Lab startups. And the 200 startups that were in this survey, some of them were successes and some of them were failures. And what's interesting is the most important factor for startup success is not the product. The most important is the timing. But it's hard for me to advise on timing. So I'd rather go to the second most important factor for success, and that's the team. And you notice the team is more important than a product, more important than the business model, more important than funding. And most startups make the mistake thinking that the product or service is the most important and do not realize that the team is more important. Okay, next. Okay, so first of all, let's examine what are the skill sets that are required to make a strong team. Number one, the CEO chairman should have management experience and business knowledge. And the CTO should be an expert in the company's IP. And also, very important, there should be a VP of sales and marketing who understands the market and has real experience acquiring paying customers. If the founding team does not have an executive that experience acquiring paying clients, it's going to be hard for the startup to succeed. And this is the area where many startups do not put in enough emphasis. Many startups that have interacted with do not have a strong person that has experience bringing pay customers. They believe that the product is so good, it will sell itself. Products never sell themselves. You need a strong sales guy to sell your products. Next. Okay. Now, many startups do not attract professional investors. And I've often had difficulty talking to the startups that the structure is not attractive to investors. And these are some of the structures. When husband and wife are the top executive, typically one of the spouse, the CEO, and the other spouse, the COO. And also another team structure that's not very favorable to investors is when 2 siblings, again, one is the CEO and the other sibling is the COO. The third structure that's also not viewed favorably by professional investors is when the 2 top executives are a parent and either a son or daughter. Now, most of these startups that I've interacted with do not like my opinion. They do not like it when I tell them that husband and wife is with a COCO functions are not attractive investors. When 2 brothers or sister or brother sister, the top executive they do not like me to tell them that that's not attractive to invest. Also, when a parent and a son or daughter are the top executive, again in a position of CEO and CEO, they do not like to hear me tell them that that's probably not going to be attractive for some investors. So typically, when startups have this kind of structure, I typically do not find it effective for me to advise them. They do not like my advice, and we usually part company. Next. Hannah, Nick, okay. Okay, so these are the positions that typically are profitable by investors. Of course, the CEO is required, but also a CTO is preferred and a VP of sales is preferred. The two job titles that are not viewed favorably by investors is a COO. So what is a COO? Typically for startups, a COO is a person who doesn't have technical expertise and also does not have sales expertise. So in the opinion of professional investors, the COO is not needed for startup. And what about the CFO? For startup, there's not a lot of work to be provided by the CFO. Typically in a startup, the CFO should be a part-time consultant, a part-time employee, not a full-time executive, not one who has significant equity ownership of the startup. So both the CEO and the CFO positions should not be included among the top executive with significant equity shares. And if these positions are in place with significant ownership, it is not viewed favorably by investors. Next. Okay, so here is my opinion based on my experience of raising money for my startup and based on my experience and knowledge advising many startups. The CEO should have typically 50 to 55% ownership. The CTO and the VP of sales should have between 10 to 15%. But combined, the three positions should not have more than 75% ownership. And there should be budget for future employees, directors, advisors, and consultants in the range of 25 to 30%. Now you will notice that some of these numbers don't add up, because if the CEO has 55%, the CTO and the VP of sales have 50% each, that's gonna not add up. So what it meant is that if the CEO was to have 55%, then the CTO and VP of sales would be part of 10%. But the important thing is that there should be a budget of 25 to 30% for everybody else. Everybody else includes future managers, future technical people, future board of directors, advisors, consultants. A lot of startups do not have 25 to 30% in the budget. I have seen many startups with 10% or less budgeted for future employees. I tried to advise one startup where the husband and wife had 92% ownership. One spouse who had the IP had 52% ownership as the CEO. The other spouse, who was a nice person, nice personality, but basically no technology expertise, no sales experience, had the position of COO with 40% ownership. So the two combined had 92% ownership. They asked me for help because they were having difficulty hiring a VP of sales and a CTO. They said that they had outstanding offers to a VP of sales and to a CTO, each at 2% ownership. And they had no luck hiring a talented person in each of those two positions. So they asked for my opinion. And I said, at this stage of the company was a very, very early stage. They should be giving 10% to each of the CTO and the VP of sales. And they told me, but we only have 8% total budget. And I said, well, that is your problem. You need to increase that 8% to something like 25, 30%, which meant that the CEO, who I think, didn't have an important contribution loan should reduce the ownership from 40% to maybe like 10%. And they did not like my advice, so I disconnected with them. Next. Okay. So these are kind of the numbers the professional investors prefer. Okay. The CEO, I mean, that they don't like. If the CEO has 60% ownership or more, investors are not going to like it. If the founding team of the 3 top executives have 80% or higher, investors are not going to like it. And if the budget for everyone else outside of the 3 executives is 20% or lower, investors are not going to like it. Because there has to be a sufficient budget to attract talented people, including board of directors, advisors, consultants, and other key positions. Next. Okay, there's also a vesting issue. Some startups have the majority of the equity fully vested when they're negotiating with investors. Investors do not like that. What investors like to see is a small upfront vesting, and the majority of the equity should be vested over 48 months. And if the majority of the equity assigned to the top executives are fully vested, they will have a very difficult time attracting professional investors. Because investors like to look at the situation where if in the future, if someone who has sufficient equity plan cannot perform the job, whether due to illness or other factors, then that position needs to be replaced. So then if a good portion of the equity for that position it has not been vested, then the unvested equity will be available for the replacement. But if most of the equity is already vested and the executive cannot perform, then there's very little equity available to attract a replacement. So investors look at the big picture. Investors will not invest if majority equity is invested before they put in the money. Next. Okay, there is a feature called 12-month cliff. Okay, the 12-month cliff is a condition in a stock plan where if an employee leaves employment in less than 12 months, either voluntary or involuntary, then that employee gets no equity. Majority of law firms highly recommend this feature. Majority of startups implement this feature. My advice is do not implement this feature. Okay, and every startup that I have personally talked to has told me that their law firm has recommended and they were going to implement. And after I talked to the CEO, every single one, 100%, agreed with me and did not implement the plan. Because in my opinion, implementing the 12-month cliff is unethical, it's unfair, and it creates strong resentment of the terminated employee. And sometimes the ex-employee will file lawsuits. Now, typically, a unemployment lawsuit against the startup is not going to hold up in court. And so the law firm would say, oh, yeah, don't worry about it, because employment is at will, so the lawsuit has no merit, so don't worry about it. But what happens is, in some cases, the ex-employee will find a law firm that will file the what they call the unfair termination on contingency. So the ex-employee does not have to spend any money out of pocket and file the lawsuit, in which case the startup CEO and its law firm will spend many hours in deposition meetings. So typically after several months and numerous deposition meetings, the law firm will advise the CEO to pay off the ex-employee and settle out of court. So the company may have spent like $20,000, $30,000 in legal expense handling those deposition meetings. and then may have to pay another $25,000, $30,000 to its employee to settle the case out of court. So my strong recommendation is do not implement the 12-month cliff vesting. If an employee worked for the company and it turns out the employment is not good for the company and the employment needs to be terminated, let's say the employee is terminated 10 or 11 months. Typically in startups, employees work for below market rate salary. But people willing to work for startups at lower than market salary because of the attraction of the stocks, that someday they might make money on the stock. So if an employee is terminated in the 10th or 11th month and the cliff vesting is enforced, the ex-employee will leave the company with no equity. And that ex-employee will be very bitter because the person will feel that it's unjust that that person, he or she, worked for the company for 10 or 11 months at below market salary and yet leave without a single share of equity. I feel very strongly that's unethical and unfair. If an employee worked for the company for 10 or 11 months at below market salary, they deserve to walk away with some equity in the company so that potentially in the future, they may receive some money from the stock. And every single startup CEO that I've talked to agrees with my view and do not implement the 12-month cliff. But every CEO that I've not talked to typically will implement because it's highly recommended law. But what some entrepreneurs do not realize, the law firm is not necessarily your friend. Because by implementing this feature, it creates potential for the law firm to make extra money by having those deposition meetings. Okay, next.
Thomas, just a time check here. I want to make sure that we've got time for.
Okay, yeah, I'm almost finished. Okay, so, okay, okay, there is many startups. The principal founder is a techie because it's usually a techie who has the vision for the product or may develop a prototype. So the tendency is the techie founder, because it's the person who came up with the vision for the company and perhaps developed the product, then typically the techie will be the CEO chairman. But however, if the techie founder does not have sufficient management experience, then that's not going to really be that effective. So I have an alternate strategy. A techie founder could run the company without being the CEO. Okay. The techie founder could be the CTO and chairman and could have majority equity of the company. And the founder then work with the board to hire a qualified CEO with lesser equity. Then it's the CEO's responsibility to hire subordinates, manage the company, raise funding, negotiate keys. And I have successfully helped some startups use this structure where the principal founder agrees to not be the CEO. Now, this is not easy for founders to accept, but sometimes this is actually a pretty good strategy. Next. Okay, so in summary, most startups think their service or product is the most important. Most investors value a strong team over the strength of the service or product. And investors will not invest if equity budget for additions to the company is too low. Okay. I think that's the end of my slide.
Great. Thank you, Thomas.
Yeah.
Great information. Really helpful.
Hannah, go back to the first slide for my email contact.
Thanks, Thomas. Really appreciate it. And I would suggest everybody who's interested, reach out to Thomas either via email or connect on LinkedIn. We can open it up for Q&A for the next 6 minutes or so. Thomas, one of the questions that I had, I can kick it off while people are either typing their questions into the chat or raising their hands on Zoom, but wondered on the VP of sales side that you said is preferred, do you expect the CEO to be doing the initial kind of first founder-led sales, or is that the role of the VP of sales in your model?
Okay, I believe the CEO should take the lead position for sales. So in my startups, I typically did not have VP of sales in the beginning. I did the sales function and then hire VP of sales and train him to be my replacement in doing sales functions. However, a lot of startup entrepreneurs do not have sales skills. They're very, very good at technology, but they're not good in sales. So then it's important to have a salesperson on the team. But if the CEO has sales skills, yes, the CEO should take the position. Also, even when the company is established, the CEO should be very active in working with the VP of sales to bring in major clients. Okay, and if the CEO is not participating, that actually hurts the company because a lot of major clients would like to negotiate deals with both the VP of sales and the CEO. So I have always been very active doing sales in all my companies. And I encourage all entrepreneurs that they should learn to do sales and they should work closely with the VP of sales with major customers.
Thank you. That's helpful. Alan, do you want to come off mute and ask your question?
I appreciate it. Thank you so much. One of the things that you had just mentioned was about management skills. And as you and I spoke in the chat room breaking up, I had a previous career in the restaurant business where I opened 33 different restaurants successfully. And those were because of my management skills to be able to operate those. Then I changed over into technology because I was affirmed that the technology that I was getting ready to build would be something that would go global. I have no experience in management in technology, but the restaurant business as well. How do investors look at that from one career field to another?
Well, like I said, what you do is you bring in, someone that has those skills that you lack, and then you work as a team. And investors know that no one person is going to have lots of different, skills. But however, if your team has the skills, that's important.
Yeah. Okay. Thomas, I'm going to get ready to send you an email right now. You and I are going to hook up.
Great.
Awesome. We've got time for one more question. Does anyone want to come off mute or throw their question in the chat?
I have a question, Taylor's Jeremy. Thanks again, Thomas. I was wondering, in your model, the 10 to 15% for the CTO, is that also accounting for a CTO that was the inventor and founder, or is that hiring a CTO?
No. That's for a CTO that's hired by the CEO.
Okay, great.
But see, I had the other business model where the founder is a technical person, but doesn't have management experience. Then that person could have the role of CTO and chairman. And then that founder and the board work together to hire an experienced CEO.
Sure.
But the founder, CTO, and chairman will have much more equity than this higher CEO.
Sure. I was looking more at a situation maybe you didn't cover with a CEO and a CTO that are co-founders. Obviously, the CTO might be the one who is the primary inventor on the IP, or at least the first patent filed.
Well, see, in that case, instead of, say, the CEO having 50% and the CTO having 10 or 15%, it could be that the CEO has like 40% and the CTO inventor has 35%.
Okay, okay. Thank you for clarifying. Appreciate it.
The point is that the three top executives combined should not have more than 75%.
Sure.
You have a budget of 25% for the rest of the people.
Yeah, thank you for clarifying. Because I was going to say that the CTO, if it was a founder CTO that was the primary inventor and was left with 15% or started with
No,
15%.
in some cases, that person may even have more than the CEO.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you for clarifying.
Thanks for the question, Jeremy. Thomas, this has been awesome. Thank you so much for your presentation. I think Hannah may have talked to you about sharing this presentation out to the attendees. So if they have questions, they can get your email.
Sure. Yeah.
But really appreciate your time, and thanks for spending time with us today.
I was just thinking about.
I think right now we'll stop this recording and then jump into MedCart's presentation. So for any of you who want to stick around for that, you're welcome to. Otherwise, Thomas, really appreciate your time and thanks for being here today.
Right. Taylor, as I mentioned, Hannah is welcome to send my PowerPoint slides to all the attendees.
Awesome. Thanks so much.
Right.
Thanks all.